the British move is that which hasn't yet been announced, I think it's likely, but not yet announced, is that it's partly intended to provide a sort of diplomatic cover for the Germans with the Leopard so that they're not acting all by themselves. And if the Germans start to provide these tanks, then there are many others in Europe who use Leopards as well, for example, the Poles. So it could make quite a difference to a future Ukrainian offensive. Well, it's been a controversial issue because the Ukrainians have been asking for more tanks, along with more of most things, since the start of the war. There are security issues. There's a lot of kit inside these tanks, and they wouldn't want the Russians to be pouring over it all. There are logistics issues. These are quite complex systems to run and maintain. And there have been concerns that the main priority for Ukraine was to defend, and that until recently, it was a bit premature to talk about counteroffensives. And then the most likely tank provider, which is Germany, with its Leopard tanks, has felt particularly inhibited about being seen to be taking such a forward role in the fight against Russia. But that's sort of been changing for over the last few weeks. And I think what's interesting about the British move is that which hasn't yet been announced, I think it's likely, but not yet announced, is that it's partly intended to provide a sort of diplomatic cover for the Germans with the Leopard so that they're not acting all by themselves. And if the Germans start to provide these tanks, then there are many others in Europe who use Leopards as well, for example, the Poles. So it could make quite a difference to a future Ukrainian offensive.
Certainly the Kremlin have been warning that providing this sort of offensive weaponry to Ukraine would provoke an escalated response. But it feels like, and please do correct me if we're wrong, that we're at the stage in the war where Western governments are no longer so concerned about that.
Well, I think, Russia's escalated in all sorts of ways already, not least by invading a neighboring country without provocation. So I don't think the nuclear issue is irrelevant to this question. It's about land warfare. It's not like other issues which have been controversial, which would be providing, say, aircraft or long-range artillery that could hit targets in Russia. This is about helping the Ukrainians recover their own land. And of course, the Russians aren't very keen on it, but I don't think that's going to impress governments. I think they've come to the point where Putin is clearly showing no interest whatsoever in a compromised political settlement. He's demanding that everybody recognizes his annexation of 4 Ukrainian provinces in addition to Crimea. So in the absence of any possibility for a diplomatic breakthrough, I think Western governments have come to the conclusion that the only way to move the conflict forward is to help Ukraine win some land battles, and maybe that will encourage Russia to look again at the situation in which it's put itself.
We also hear the chief of the Ukrainian Defence Intelligence has said or suggested that Kyiv is looking to plan a major offensive in the spring when the weather improves. Does that all tie up? Obviously, the tanks have got to be supplied. The Ukrainian soldiers have still got to learn how to use them, haven't they? Presumably, the technology is different to the tanks that they're currently using at the moment. Does that tie in with the suggestion then that a major offensive in the spring could well be on the cards?
Yes, I think it fits. It takes a while for these to be delivered. It takes a while for the troops to learn how to use them, though I think the Ukrainians have shown themselves perfectly competent in these things. There are issues in that there's a number of, not just tanks, but of the Germans and the Americans announced last week that they'd be sending armored carriers that are a bit less than tanks. All of these have their own logistic issues, supply problems, and so on. So the managing all of these systems is not a straightforward matter, and I think that's going to take a certain amount of time to work out. But it does sort of fit in with spring offensives.
Finally, Lawrence, we've heard that 2 British aid workers have gone missing in Ukraine. What can the UK do in terms of trying to track them down?
Well, from what I understand, they were in the Solidar area, close to Bakhmut. Now, this is the most vicious, grueling fighting going on around there. The Wagner group, sort of Russian mercenaries, have been pouring everything into trying to take these towns. It's the only offensive the Russians have got going, and the Ukrainians are resisting bitterly. So one fears that they've entered into an area which is chaotic, as all these areas can be, with front lines moving back and forth, and dangerous. I don't know enough about it to offer an opinion on their situation, except that they're in a very high risk area.
Yeah.